Hello, my name is Dana Henderson. I'm the registered dietitian and diabetes educator for Stony Point Women's Health. Thank you so much for whoever is joining us today to go over challenging emotional eating. This is a topic that I find myself teaching in my clinic all of the time. I think it's a topic that's pertinent to everybody and is even more pertinent with, unfortunately, all of the stressors that we have in our lives right now. Of note, aside from my role at Stony Point Women's Health as a dietitian and diabetes educator, I am also one of the providers who attends our VCU Ramble. So I'm just going to use this opportunity to plug it. That is a group walk that we have actually moved remotely for this season with the COVID concerns that we do on the third Saturday of every month that I strongly encourage you all to come to. It's a good opportunity to talk with me, talk with some of the other VCU Health providers, and it would be a great time to give me your feedback on this webinar today. So again, that is the third Saturday of every month. So our next one is coming up next weekend on Saturday at 8:30. So definitely something I strongly encourage you to attend. So my plug aside, let's get started on challenging emotional eating. So today we're going to talk about, of course, what emotional eating is. We're going to talk about the difference between emotional and physical hunger. We're going to talk about strategies to tackle physical hunger and strategies to tackle emotional hunger. So emotional eating, I really believe, is really important to define and talk about what the actual process of it is so that we can work on tackling it from a bunch of different angles. This is a very complex topic that more and more individuals and teams are researching, and it's really exciting to see how all of this research is developing. So at baseline, emotional eating is eating that is used to soothe or respond to negative emotions rather than a physiological cue set by the body. So in this scenario, typically we have some sort of emotional trigger. It doesn't have to be good, bad, it could really just be any sort of emotion. So for example, it could be stress, it could be sadness, but it could also be things like boredom, it could be excitement. We always think of, we're celebrating a new job, we're gonna go get an ice cream cone. So any sort of emotional trigger. However, we most often think about it in regards to negative emotions. So in the case of an emotional trigger, we know that food is a fantastic way of coping. It releases hormones in our body when we eat that help us to feel good. So a lot of times when people are dealing with emotions, they're going to crave eating or crave certain types of foods that are going to give them those positive feelings and help them cope with whatever emotion they're experiencing. So what do we do when we are craving food? We eat. When we eat, that gives us that momentary satisfaction. But sometimes when we're unable to regulate that, we'll accidentally overconsume or maybe consume more than we intended or eat when we're not hungry. Unfortunately, in some situations, this can lead to shame and guilt. This is a piece that we're going to dissect immediately. But what I always like to mention is that sometimes the shame and guilt can actually perpetuate this cycle. So now that feeling of feeling very negatively about overeating or emotionally eating can act as that emotional trigger to perpetuate that cycle. So today we're going to talk about all of these different pieces. We're going to talk about dealing with emotional triggers, different ways to monitor our consumption, and how to tackle some of those core negative feelings. So the most important thing to do when we're identifying physical versus emotional hunger is really just sussing out some of the differences. So with physical hunger, it's typically something that begins really gradually. We usually feel it in our stomach. Sometimes you might get some other sensations, for example, feeling like irritable, maybe feeling a little bit lightheaded or not focused, tired. And it's usually kind of a growing pain that comes in waves. It will really grow pretty slowly, and eventually it will hit a intensity where you can't ignore it, but it's really a pretty slow process. When we're physically hungry, we'll be open to most foods. So this isn't to say that you're going to eat your least favorite food in the world if you're starving, but it's possible that you would be pretty open to most things that you are offered. And of course, if we're physically hungry and then we eat, we're going to feel full or satisfied afterwards. Emotional hunger is actually quite the opposite. So emotional hunger typically starts really suddenly. So there's some sort of trigger or impulse, and then we're experiencing kind of this wanting, this need. Typically, it's something you cannot get out of your head. So it's not like physical hunger where like your tummy might be rumbling, but you can ignore it for a moment. It feels like it's the only thing on your mind. It tends to be very persistent. And the one that really does it for me is it tends to have a certain fixation. So it's usually a specific thing we are craving. We might want salty, we want chips, we want popcorn, or we might want sweet. We want to go to the ice cream store, or we want to drive across town and go to Kroger. And of course, in emotional eating, we might feel guilty or unsatisfied after eating. So after we have kind of surpassed that initial good feeling, we're not feeling the kind of coping that we were really hoping for with this food. So of course, the first thing we do with any problem is we got to figure out why it's happening, so we can kind of nip it in the bud where it starts. So physical hunger, obvious reasons we might be very physically hungry is that we haven't eaten recently. Typically, most people will start to feel hungry after about 4 to 6 hours of not eating. And it's possible that even if you are eating every 4 to 6 hours, you might not be eating some foods that are keeping you full. So we're going to talk about protein, fiber, and healthy fats today, which are foods that are digested more slowly and help us to stay fuller, and how we can integrate them into our meals and snacks. Emotional hunger, of course, is going to come from some sort of emotion. So it can be any emotional need that needs addressing. Anxiety, depression, stress, loneliness. Unfortunately, this time of year, this is very common. With both the quarantine, our political culture, just kind of the dark, dreary days, it's very possible that we will have some additional emotions, and that's okay. And the one piece that I'm really going to emphasize today is emotional hunger can be triggered by restricting foods. So we talked about that kind of guilt and shame. So when we restrict foods, we're going to want them more. So we're going to talk about how to kind of make all foods fit today so that we can reduce our incidence of emotional hunger. So when we are looking for a solution for physical hunger, one of the tools that I regularly like to use in clinic is the hunger scale. So the hunger scale is fantastic because it's a tool that gives objective data about our hunger. So hunger scale can be used in a variety of ways, but typically how it works is I am absolutely starving. I am miserable. I will eat anything that you put in front of me. And then it's a scale up to 10 where you are feeling beyond full. So that's when you eat too much, your tummy feels really full, you might feel really tired, and you might feel like you need to lay down and take a nap. In between that spectrum, there are all different shades. So typically speaking, we want our physical hunger to land somewhere between a 3 and a 4. So we want to be eating when we're slightly hungry to hungry, but not when we're starving, because that makes it more difficult for us to regulate our intake. And additionally, we want to stop when we're feeling satisfied or full and not uncomfortable or stuffed. So there's a couple different ways that I've had individuals use this tool. For example, for people who feel like they really overeat at meals, whether it be emotional eating or just kind of not paying attention, we talk about, assessing your hunger at the beginning of the meal, and then assessing your hunger at the end of the meal, waiting 20 minutes and assessing again. And then I always say, if you're still slightly hungry at the end of that meal, go get something else. So it's just a good way to provide objective data. Other ways that I've seen people use it is I have a lot of people who will say, I feel fine all day, and then by 5 p.m. I'm starving. So I might have them use this tool every 2 hours, and we'll say, okay, we know at 3 p.m. you're a 5, but then by 5 p.m. you're a 2. So we might know that we need to put a snack or a lunch in between that period. So there's a lot of different ways to use this tool. And I strongly encourage everybody, whether you're struggling with this or not, to just get into the habit of assessing their hunger before meals and throughout the day. So using the hunger scale, if you find that you are somebody who finds yourself less than a 3, so you're absolutely starving all of the time, and this is causing you to overeat, Some suggestions would just be eating on a schedule. So really trying to eat every 4 to 5 hours. This, of course, can be really difficult. Some people have really crazy work schedules, but I always tell people eating is a priority. It's something that you need to fuel your body, and it's really important, just as anything else. Even if it means putting it on your calendar, setting an alarm to make sure you eat. I have a lot of people right now who are working from home and find it really hard to kind of remember to eat on a schedule. So finding a way to make sure that we are not digging ourselves that hole of not eating throughout the day and then being starving. And then eating breakfast every day. This is a topic I've actually seen more and more research come out for, but typically they are finding that people who eat a breakfast in the morning tend to consume less calories throughout the day. So they're finding a lot of research to show that eating breakfast can be really helpful for both weight maintenance as well as appetite or satiety. And then, of course, adding more fiber, protein, and unsaturated fats to your meals and snacks. So let's say, I'm eating every 4 hours, I'm eating breakfast every day, and I still feel like I'm just starving. We really want to investigate those meals. So, of course, is it enough food? Am I having a really tiny plate? Maybe I'm a really big person. And then is it the types of foods that are going to keep us full? So, for example, I always think of potato chips. I could probably eat this office full of potato chips and not feel full. So when we are looking at our foods, we really want to be looking for foods that are higher in fiber. So for foods that are high in fiber, it's going to be like our fruits, our vegetables, our beans and legumes, our whole grains that are going to keep us fuller. So this might be the difference of opting for a whole grain cracker as a snack. We also want to be looking at some proteins. So of course, we always think of our meat, fish, eggs, but other examples like our nut butters, our low-fat cheeses, our Greek yogurts, and our beans are great sources of protein as well. So really making sure that we're having that at all meals and snacks. And then, of course, our healthy sources of fat. Fat digests really slowly compared to some of the other macronutrients, so it really tends to keep us fuller for longer. So good sources of our healthy fats, which are unsaturated fats, are going to be things like our fish, our eggs, our nuts and seeds, and our avocado. So I do encourage you, if you are a person who is feeling like you're really hungry all day long and you just don't know why because you're eating 3 meals a day, start investigating the types of foods you're eating and see if there's any things from this list that you can add. So just some good examples, because I always get asked, what is the best snack? I always tell people the goal is for snacking is to help us feel fuller. So we really want to be emphasizing foods that are going to satiate us and give us energy to make it to our next meal. So I divided this by kind of crunchy munchy and sweet tooth, because I know there's kind of 2 different stackers out there. So some examples of like a more savory snack would be a small apple with peanut butter. So I'm getting my apple, that's a fantastic source of fiber, but then I have my peanut butter, which is a great source of protein and a great source of unsaturated fats. So that's something that's going to keep me for full really long, even though it's just a snack. For somebody who likes sweets, a good example might be plain non-fat Greek yogurt. It's a great source of protein, and then adding some fruit on top of it, like some berries, which are really high in fiber, or maybe I'm going to slice up some peaches. So another example of a protein and fiber pairing that's going to keep me fuller for longer. And then, of course, we have the opposite side of the scale, where you often feel yourself overeating. I always say these 2 go together. A lot of times we'll find that we're really hungry and then we've overeaten, and we're really hungry and then we've overeaten. Anytime we're feeling really hungry, it's kind of harder to regulate these things. So, of course, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're not really hungry all the time. So working with some of those other tips that we just found. But then we do want to be evaluating our meal times to figure out why we are eating too much. We're eating past our fullness, eating past that 7 on the hunger scale. So the first thing I always recommend is taking a seat. Again, eating is really important. It is something that you should make time for. It is really easy to eat on the run. It's really easy to eat in the car, but we really do want to take a moment to sit down, sit in front of our meal and enjoy it. We want to avoid distractions. People who tend to eat in front of the TV, eat in front of the computer, I know I'm guilty of like playing on my smartphone, tend to overeat or eat more because they're not paying attention to the food they're eating. And then focusing on the food, especially those people who cook. I always say, why are you distracted when you're eating this beautiful meal that you have just put all this effort into? So this can look like a variety of different things. Sometimes it's just taking the moment to be a little bit mindful and think about, what that food is providing for you, but even just thinking about the food itself. So, wow, these green beans are really tender, or wow, these strawberries are really ripe. Taking a moment to truly appreciate the foods that you're eating. You could focus on taste, you could focus on smells. We really want to be using this as an entire experience rather than just something we have to do throughout the day. Eating really slowly. I know I have always notoriously been kind of like a shoveler. I'm getting the next bite before I've even finished chewing the last. So some tips for this, for example, for me, it's putting my fork down in between bites. So making sure that I'm not just continuously going. For other people, it might look like taking a sip of water between their bites. I've had people who say they count their chewing. Seems like a little bit much, but there's certainly a lot of ways that we can slow down our eating so we actually have a chance to process how full we are. And then, of course, it does take a moment from things to get to our mouth to our tummy. So it takes a minute for us to decide if we are a 7 on that scale. So if you have finished your meal and you feel that you are still hungry, that's fine. We do typically ask that you just try to wait about 20 minutes before you go and grab something else so that you can fully and accurately assess if you are truly physically hungry or if you're already too full. And of course, we always want to make sure that we're hydrating. Making sure that you get enough water throughout the day is really important in keeping us full, as well as for a ton of other reasons that we want to stay hydrated. So now we're going to transition into what this webinar is truly about, which is emotional eating. I do talk about the physical hunger piece first because it's really tied in. Being too hungry will make us emotional. Being too full will make us emotional. And we live in a culture where our emotions are so heavily tied to what we eat. So the one thing I always ask of my patients or people I'm working with who are struggling with emotional eating is to really open their minds and evaluate this process. So many people will say to me, I just feel so out of control. I feel like I have no control over what I'm eating. So I always encourage people to look at this feeling with curiosity and not shame. And that's when we're really talking about breaking that cycle between the shame and guilt and then restarting the emotional trigger that leads to overeating. Some ways to do this, the shameful thinking might be, I can't trust myself around food. And I encourage people to think, what needs are you neglecting right now? Why are you feeling that way? Why do you feel like you can't trust yourself? Is that a true thought? Other examples is people will say, I can't believe I ate all that. I'm disgusting. It was bad that I did that. I was bad. And I would say, be curious about it. So what would you do next time? Of course, we can sit here and we can feel bad and why? Let's think about solving this problem. And then, of course, I have so many people say, I have no willpower, I'm worthless. This is not about willpower. What is this experience telling you about your emotions and your stress and your sadness and your motivation? You might be using this as a coping mechanism, and that's fine. Realistically, food is a good coping mechanism. It feels good. But we really want to evaluate what other types of things we can other types of tools we can use to deal with those emotions, and then allowing ourselves the space to use them. So sometimes I really just start people with reframing their thinking. What is the way I currently address food? Where does that thinking come from? Is it things that I've heard in the media? Is it things that I've heard from my family? And how can I reframe the way that I think about that? There is a lot of different really practical ways to work with this. So some tools that I've found to be helpful is ending black and white thinking. So I always tell people there is no such thing as a bad food. Food does not have any inherent moral value unless you stole it. There's nothing wrong with it. So typically, no single meal can prevent you from reaching your health goals. So for example, I always have people say, I had a bad day. And they'll tell me about this beautiful day they had with fruits and vegetables and whole grains, but then they had 2 cookies at the end of their day. It's not a bad day. There was plenty of different great things there. So we really don't want to generalize and think about foods as kind of complex things. So for example, why do you look at a cookie as bad? And what are some other qualities about cookies? Cookies have carbohydrates. So we want to be focusing on some more neutral ways to describe food. So for example, it's tasty, etc. So one exercise for this is listing those foods that perhaps are problematic and really trying to look at them in a more holistic way. So not labeling things as good and bad, and instead looking at kind of the shades of gray in between that black and white thinking. The second piece, and I love this, is creating abundance. They have found over and over and over again that when we restrict foods, we tend to overeat them the second we are presented with them again. So one example is they did a study where they presented people who were dieting with milkshakes. And they said, for this study, you are taste testing these milkshakes. What did they find? The people who were dieting and felt like they couldn't have milkshakes drank way more of the milkshakes than the people who were not dieting. So when we are restricting ourselves of foods, sorry, my computer logged out, we tend to overeat. So one of the ways that I have my patients challenge this is giving yourself unconditional permission to eat. This is really hard when we have kind of this culture that tells us, oh, you can't eat after 6 p.m. and you can't have sweets and you can't have sugar and you can't have this. You can't have anything. You can. You're allowed to. So I tell people the more comfortable we can get around certain foods, and this is something called food habituation, the more in control we're going to feel the next time we're presented with that food. So one exercise is, for example, having people bring these foods into the home and journaling their feelings when they're consuming the food. So for example, if I feel like I really need to avoid ice cream because every time I bring it into my house, I binge eat it. And I ate the whole pint instead of just the half a pint or a quarter of a pint like I said I was going to do. I want to bring that food into my home so that I can get used to having it around, and then ideally, I won't feel like I need to jump all over it every time it's in my house. This is a process, as is any exercise. The first time we do it, we might eat more than we intended, but we want to be using those things like the food journal or even just a regular journal to assess our feelings surrounding this situation. And of course, with any emotional issue, we always want to practice self-compassion. Replace I should with I want. What do you want in this moment? When you're emotional eating, is it that you need a hug? Is it that you just want to feel good? And do you want this food? And it's okay if you do. There's no technical rules. We always think of all these rules, but we are in control of our own lives. And then, of course, speaking to yourself as you would a friend. I always tell somebody, what would you say if your sister, your cousin, your mom, your dad came to you and said, oh, I'm such an idiot. I just ate, a bunch of cookies and I have no willpower and I am worthless. You wouldn't allow that. You would say, don't worry about it. Big deal. It's just a couple cookies. You'll do better tomorrow. Treat yourself as a friend. Again, the nicer and more compassionate we are to ourselves, the better these things get. So we do want to practice moving away from food guilt and moving towards food gratitude. So, of course, there are going to be times where we need some sort of coping mechanism. Again, food is a good one, but I do encourage people to really think about what they need in that moment. So, for example, if we're bored, sometimes we just need something to entertain us, right? So that might look like doing like a crossword puzzle or playing a video game instead. If we are stressed, looking for something that's going to help relieve that stress, maybe doing yoga, maybe going on a walk. If we're angry, maybe calling somebody and complaining. There are a lot of other ways to cope with negative emotions that can result in more positive health outcomes. What I tell people, do it for 10 minutes. If you still want to eat, have something to eat. The goal is that we just want to find another way to separate ourselves from that emotion and cope with it. And of course, there are a lot of different ways to do this. And of course, unfortunately, there are some problems that both food and other coping skills cannot solve. I do always encourage any individuals struggling to get help. There are all sorts of resources out there. There is one specific to concerns with eating or eating disorders that you can reach out to. So please, please, please get the help you need. If you are having a problem, there's someone out there who's willing to listen to you. Food is a good coping mechanism, and we have all these other good coping mechanisms too, but sometimes we really just need to ask for help. All right, so that is my spiel. So we got physical hunger, emotional hunger, different strategies to work with them. And that's all I got for today. So thank you so very much for coming to my talk today on emotional eating. Once again, I am Dana Henderson. I'm the registered dietitian and diabetes educator for Stony Point Women's Health. And I thank you so much for joining me today.